Well, good evening. This is Mel here from Sneakers Corner, and we have our good friend Lloyd de Jongh back to talk to us about St. Paul distorting the Gospels. Would that be right? Or that's the
Yeah,
claim. That's the claim.
correct.
Um, and I keep seeing the idea that there are time machines going on because St. Paul died before three of the Gospels were actually even written, but yet he's distorted the gospel somehow. He's a magic man. But in any case, there's a few things that you want to talk to us about initially. Like one of the things you mentioned before the program is that there are definitions that perhaps Muslims use differently to how we see them. Maybe you want to
Correct.
go into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to just clarify that because we see things from our perspective, from a Western point of view, and not from the perspective of that culture, which defines these words and concepts vastly differently, sometimes opposite to the way we do. And this can lead to confusion. So hello, everyone, and thank you, Mel, for having me back on. Much
My
appreciated.
pleasure. Yeah, no, the honor is all mine now, I have to say. Thank you.
So let me share my screen. I'll share my system audio because I want to play later a short clip by Bart Ehrman, of all things, who destroys the Islamic narrative.
Okay.
Because Muslims love to quote him as a source, but yet when he contradicts them, maybe they will take that as gospel to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So shall we just jump in?
Yeah. Do you want me to share this now?
Should we do a quick recap, or I will do a recap though.
Yeah. Do you want? Well, up to you. If you want to do the recap now, feel free.
I will get to the recap. So
okay. I'll do you want me to add this to the stream? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me back, and thank you for being here. So briefly, we are discussing the accusation of the corruption of the Bible. Okay, this includes the Torah as well as the New Testament. That's what we covered last week. We started with the original source, the early 8th century sources, and we're moving up to the 14th century. We're going to cover today some of the more well-known scholars, and we're going to look at how this story evolved, how the scholars contradict each other, how they overlap, and so on. However, there were some questions raised after the last one, and I want to clarify a few points, if I may. Briefly, just so you know, this is what the Kaaba looks like. It is a work of art, as you can see, and it rivals things like St. Paul's in Rome. I can, yeah, just so people might be interested to know how beautiful the Kaaba is.
Wow. That's
incredible.
Is it any wonder they're covered with a cloth? I've definitely seen better brickwork.
I've seen barbecues built nicer than this, but
yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I just wanted to raise that. So okay, let me continue. So a couple of things that came up last week, right? I mentioned, and I'm not going to dwell here, but I want you to understand, Islam is divided into, there are two divisions in Islam, and there are 4 levels, right? Now, while you may say that in Judaism and Christianity there are these levels, don't assume they are the same as what is in Islam. So the divisions are the Sharia and the Haqiqah. The Sharia is effectively just obeying Allah, regulations and rules. Now, this is important because Islam does not define itself as a religion. It is a deen. When you look up the word deen in the oldest and the most authoritative of the Islamic dictionaries, like the Lisan al-Arab, you find out that the word deen, that deen has 4 different meanings, 4 layers of meaning. Religion is only about the 11th or 12th definition in the 3rd level. Right? So as a religion, Islam is only maybe 5% religion. It is mostly a political and legal system, right? So there's about 12 definitions before religion, which are more important, which are primary. So religion is only tertiary, and then it's the last of the tertiary definitions, right? And that is regulation. In fact, the deen is literally defined as a totalitarian political system, right? Then you have the haqiqah, knowing Allah. This is reserved purely for the upper level, the elite scholars. This is reserved strictly for those scholars. Islam then divides itself into the zahir, which is the outer or exoteric, meaning for the masses. Then you have the batin, right? The inner or the esoteric. Esoteric means secret, right? So you have the outer meaning and the outer practice. However, and this also means the first level of meaning. So when you read a book like the Quran, what is the first obvious plain meaning that you derive from what you read? That is the very first level of meaning. It is not necessarily the last or the most important. It's just the first impression you get.
I get the idea that the outer meaning is reserved for the people who practice Sharia, whereas the inner is for that hakika.
Yes,
that's the idea.
Correct. In fact, what they call it, well, what they mean by this is that they literally call it Islam for the masses. So the lowest level, which a lay Muslim is on, 99% of your Muslims, they call it Islam for the masses. That's what the scholars call it. Then, so you've got, and then on the hakika, you've got the inner, the direct, the personal knowledge or experience of Allah. Understand this is subjective, because it is not rational. It is what they call pre-rational and post-rational. It is not rational by any stretch of the imagination in any way that we would define rational.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry to interrupt you. If we take, say, the average Dawah member that you might find in Speaker's Corner, or who often come on the comment sections under our videos, where would they fall in this? Are they just the lowest level? So they really don't have a clue any more than the mass of Muslims, really?
Technically, now, we don't really know, because I actually am struggling to make up my mind as to whether they're ignorant or just hiding the information that they know. I really, one day I think they don't know, and another day I think they know it, but they're hiding it. So part of it has become common cultural knowledge. So they must, to some degree, have knowledge of it. There must be an awareness on some level, to some degree. However, technically, they are going to be literally at the lowest level. If they're not part of the ulama, then they are on the lowest level of knowledge. They are ranked. They are ranks, though. It does rise in rank. Now the 4 levels are the ibara, the ishara, the lata'if, and the haqa'iq. Right? The ibara is the literal level. Right? And this is the zahir. And this is where you find the Quran and the hadiths. Okay? This is what lay Muslims have access to. Now, scholastic knowledge, what they call the knowledge of the theology, right, is forbidden to lay Muslims. The imams may not teach scholastic knowledge to the lay Muslim, because this will incur doubt. Doubt must be forbidden. Doubt must be banned. Doubt must be rejected. There must be no doubt, must never be introduced at all costs, because this will destroy their faith, their iman, right? So if the Quran and the hadiths are permissible to lay Muslims, then it is at the lowest level of knowledge in Islam. It is the absolute bottom, scratching the bottom of the levels of knowledge of Islam. Understand? It's for dummies. It's Islam for dummies. If I can put it that way. Then you have, for the scholars, your different levels of scholars. You have the ishara, the implied level, right? Now, when Muslims say, well, the Quran's literal, that's because it's ibara, it's zahir. And when they say, well, it's metaphorical, that's because it's ishara. You see? So both are true.
Yeah, and so they can play, and depending on the situation, they can play one off the other and say, no, it means the other, if it suits them. So this is the dance that they do. They can't be pinned down, because they always have a backup. They can jump to the other one if they need to. Yeah.
Correct. Now you have the lata'if. Now the lata'if is for the highest level of the scholars, levels 3 and 4, not your level 2, your levels 3 and 4. Now, strictly speaking, these are Sufis. Now, when Muslims tell you the Sufis, look, don't believe a word you're told. The Sufis are the elite level of Islam. They are the best scholars, the most elite scholars. They are involved in what we call the spiritual level, but technically is the occultic level, the mystical, right? Now, these are nuances in the text. These are subtleties meant for saints. All the saints in Islam are Sufi saints, by the way. Then you have the haqa'iq. Technically, this is the level reserved for the prophets. However, it is a level accessible to the greatest of the Sufis, and therefore, technically, they are prophets too. They are able to access this level. The haqa'iq is the ultimate reality. It is the essence of reality. It is the substrate of reality. And Muhammad happens to be that essence and substrate of reality, the Ruh Muhammad, the spirit of Muhammad. It is called the Muhammadan reality, right? And Muhammad is that divine essence that makes, because Allah made the world for Muhammad. He made the universe for Muhammad. And in fact, he may have made the universe of Muhammad, right? And the Ruh Muhammad, the spirit of Muhammad, transmits divine knowledge to the prophets and the Sufi saints. So I just want to leave that there. I'm not going to go into any more depth. I will just leave that and we'll move on. Yes?
I just make a quick link with what you've just said and some recent videos where I've looked at the art of Muhammad, or the artwork about Muhammad over the centuries. And it's clear that from the 16th century onwards, you see Muhammad being presented with radiant light all around him. And that seems to hint at number 4 there.
Yes. No, it goes, he's divine. Muhammad is divine. Let's, you know. So
Yeah.
now I want to mention again the second point. There was some question about the idea of rhetoric in Islam. Understand, Islam has its own definitions. They don't use yours. I'm sorry to say that. Okay, they use their own. They have their own. They don't use Aristotle's definitions. They don't use the Webster definitions. They don't use the Encyclopedia Britannica definitions. They have their own. They use their own. They don't care about ours. They're not interested.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to make that plain. If you see it from your personal definition, you are not seeing it from their angle. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, adab is very important. It is also known as sunnah. Okay, and rhetoric is a science. Now, there was some rather interesting comments. I'll leave it at that. But understand, we don't see in the modern world rhetoric as a science. Now, you can argue back and forth about what Aristotle did, what the Greeks did. We're not talking about Aristotle. We're not talking about the Greeks. We're talking about the Muslims and how they perceive and apply this. Now, rhetoric, adab, is part of mysticism. However, you'll see these two definitions that are going to be important. I'm going to go through these in rapid fashion. In military science, the plural form adab is a synonym of hiyal, known as stratagems in warfare. Hiyal is also, not every Arabic word has 2 to 3 or more definitions. An Arabic word can have 14 definitions easily, right? Hiyal is also the main form of Islamic deception. It is their main, most evolved, most developed doctrine of deception. There were books on this in the year 805 already. Hiyal, in practice, allows them to break any promise, any contract, any oath, any agreement. Okay? It is the main, forget taqiyya, that's a minor distraction. Hiyal is the main form of deception within Islam. It is very sophisticated. Now, let's go to adab al-jadal, controversial. Right? Jadal means to be controversial, and the controversialists, we would call them propagandists today. Propagandists, right? In theology and law, it's a method of debating in which were discussed questions that were controversial. Now, how they use the word, it's how it's interpreted. Remember, Muslims know that it's how it's interpreted. It's not how you interpret it, it's how they interpret this. Okay? It was not a matter of finding truth, but of convincing, of winning. It was a matter of winning, not a matter of determining fact and truth. Understand? So now I will move on. Hiyal, artifices, stratagems, the means of evading a thing or effecting an object, mechanical artifices, tricks. In law, it is circumventions of the law. Hiyal, remember I said to break contracts, to break the Sharia, to break any. Hiyal allows Muslims to break any and every tenet of Islamic law. Nothing is sacrosanct. Understand that. There is not a single thing, anything can be broken, can be circumvented. So these are circumventions of the law. Legal devices, in fact, other definitions you'll find are legal trickery. Okay, if you read the Sharia itself, this is from the Encyclopedia of Islam. If you read the Sharia, it will tell you it is legal trickery. The use of legal means for extra legal ends. Extra legal means outside the law, lawless, breaking the law legally. Questions?
This reminds me very much of the sort of things that maybe the CIA would get up to, the psyops, where, you know, they are untouchable, they go outside the bounds of the law, and the main thing is their military objective is all that matters. It seems like this is...
Technically it's legal, but it's fully illegal. Now notice in military science, hiyal with synonyms maqa'id and adab, notice adab suddenly, now you discover, now understand, this is the Encyclopedia of Islam. It's $40,000 to buy this thing. Do understand though that it is written by Western scholars and Muslim scholars, okay? However, I will tell you that the Muslim scholars, when they write these, many of them are apologists for Islam, and they will whitewash, they will delete, they will insert, they will fudge what you read here. So understand, be careful, don't believe everything you read. Adab, but notice adab is also a military science. So their form of debate, a technical term for stratagems of war, their form of debate is also a dishonest stratagem of war. Is this making sense?
Yeah. It reminds me, I'm just thinking back to Muhammad Hijab's famous debate with David Wood, and he used a whole plethora of dirty tactics throughout the debate. So this sounds exactly like what you're talking about here.
Yeah, there's a lot more to this, but understand. So when you tell me, but rhetoric means, no, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It's what they think it means. This is what they think. They don't care what you think. Islamic debate, which is why Muslims will always tell you, let's have a debate, because they have a particular strategy, a method of dishonest, deceitful debate, which goes back to the 8th century. Moving on. Now, let's have a look here. Operations of white magic. Okay, fascinating. Fakery, creating of illusions. Interesting. Sleight of hand. Hiyal. Hiyal means creating illusions. Magic. Amulets which have an extraordinary power over men and over natural phenomenon, and acts done by magicians. Magicians perform hiyal, acts of illusions. Understand, there's layering and context here. Let's move on. Ilm al-Badi, the branch of rhetorical science. Okay, so again, rhetoric is a science. Like you have test tubes to measure things and weights, and they have science, right? Which deals with the beautification. Islam loves its euphemisms. The beautification of literary style, the artifices of the ornamentation and embellishment of speech. Embellishment, exaggeration, deceitful use of speech. Now, this is the second time the word artifice has come up. Let's have a look at the word artifice. The use of a clever trick or something intended to deceive. Muslims intend to deceive. Their rhetoric is deceitful rhetoric. It's not your rhetoric, it's their rhetoric. Artifice, clever trick, cunning, crafty devices or expedients, wile, especially used to trick or deceive others, trickery, guile, false or insincere behavior. They're not using the other definitions, they're using these definitions. Now, if further required, I can go to the very explicit Sharia commands, the rulings in the Sharia, Islamic law, sacred Islamic law, which makes lying obligatory, not optional, obligatory to defend Islam. Now, let's take an example of a definition in the West, which we mean one way, and Islam means in exactly the opposite way. Right. Let's have a look. Slander, oral defamation, an untruth about another, which will harm the reputation of that person. Okay, great. Now let's look at that same word, slander, in the legal ruling of the Sharia, Islamic law, which is my expertise, in Islam. If you notice something good, it is sunnah to mention it. But if you notice something bad, it is unlawful to mention it. This is slander.
So this is for their own side. It's unlawful to mention something about their own side. It would presumably be okay with someone else.
Don't forget, Sharia applies to them and to you.
Yeah.
Sharia is universal. It applies to non-Muslims as much as Muslims.
Yeah.
So telling the truth that someone would not like is slander. In the West, lying about someone to smear them is slander. In Islam, telling the truth is slander. If it's an unpleasant truth that they don't want told. Understand?
Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I would say that their definition sounds a bit like the definition for calumny, which is saying the truth about a person in order to damage them.
But this is not saying so. This is not telling the truth in order to damage them. This is a prohibition on anything negative. Yeah. Let's have a look. Let's further look.
Yeah.
So in the Sharia, okay, the talebearer who stirs up enmity. Now, Muhammad did not lie except for 3 things. One of those things was to keep the peace, okay, which allows lying for a number of causes within Islam. But slanderer, okay, they speak of the slanderer. Obey not every slanderer. He who stirs up enmity among people by quoting their words to each other will not enter paradise. So now this would apply as well. They will apply forward to us, so that when you cause friction, because they're allowed to lie to keep the peace, right? So therefore, when there is friction, when there is argument or conflict, they're allowed to lie, right? So let's have a look. Slander. Let's look at slander itself, the meaning of slander. And they also mention within the Sharia, there are 6 reasons for them to slander. They have 6 conditions for allowing them to slander you. And this is the legal definition of slander in Islam. Slander means to mention anything concerning a person that you would dislike. This is not a Western definition.
Yeah.
Make sense, Mel?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, yeah. I was just thinking back that word that you mentioned earlier on, which was like a sleight of hand or misdirection. I was thinking of a very common technique I've seen in the comment section. We're talking about one topic, and they throw in some sort of smoke bomb to distract the audience. They bring up the Trinity, or they bring up the Bible was written in the 4th century, or some other distraction like that, and hopefully get everyone talking about that. And that seems like it fits in with this kind of idea of sleight of hand.
It's part of the ilm al-bari, but also it's part of the adab al-jadal. So it's part of their strategies for their debate form.
Yeah.
But this goes back to the 8th century already. They perfected
Right.
this methodology.
Yeah.
Right. So now I'll do one more, tale bearing. Okay, related to slander. Okay, tale bearing. It means quoting someone's words to another in a way that worsens relations between them. So if you say the Quran says and it causes friction, well, you are tale bearing, you are slandering, you are creating, and they have to defend themselves because you're saying things that are true that are causing a worsening of relations. This is not legal in Islam.
Right. Okay. So that's how they keep control of the narrative. You know, if anyone notices anything that doesn't quite fit, they can use this against them.
So tale bearing is not limited to that, but rather consists of revealing anything whose disclosure is resented.
Right. That's pretty all-encompassing then. Yeah.
So hopefully this is clear. These are not Western definitions of these terms. These are laws in Islam. This is the Sharia is absolute, and the Sharia can never be abrogated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this sort of on the same level as spreading mischief in the land? Is that kind of tale-bearing kind of like that?
That is simply just temptation away from Islam. Mischief in the land is actually just temptation by offering an alternative to Islam and luring people away by creating doubt. Doubt is illegal. Doubt is a crime. So revealing something confidential whose disclosure is resented. A person should not speak of anything he notices about people besides that which benefits a Muslim. If it does not benefit the Muslim, this must be stopped.
Yeah.
So does that... Okay, so talebearers are corrupt. You must hate him for the sake of Allah, and hating for the sake of Allah is obligatory. Why are you spreading hate? But I'm just quoting the Quran. You're spreading hate. Have you heard that before, Mel?
Absolutely, and we can understand why the Muslims turned on Yasser Qadi like that. Whenever when he started mentioning about holes in the narrative, they just turned on him.
You're telling the truth.
He went from hero to zero, like within split seconds. All loyalty out the window.
Right. Does this clarify what we're talking about here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, everyone. Okay. So thank you very much for that, allowing me that diversion. I hope that was educational and helpful, Mel.
Yeah, it was very good. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
Right. So that was the 10-cent tour of the Sharia. Now, to clarify, to add to something from last week's the previous show, remember St. Paul apparently fakes his conversion. He's a Jew. He's the king of the Jews. He leaves the rabbis bribe him, so the rabbis give the king of the Jews money, and he then leaves his throne and becomes a fake Christian. I don't know how much money they gave him, but the rabbis must have had a ton to bribe the king. And he then becomes a fake Christian. He has a fake vision on the road to Damascus, and then of course he becomes a Christian, and he then convinces the Christians to abandon the jihad, and this is why they had to make up that story that St. Paul abandoned or made Christians abandon the jihad, right? That he altered the Bible, right? He literally altered the Bible and told Christians you must abandon the jihad because they ran into that problem in Quran 9:111. They said, indeed, Allah has purchased from the believers their lives and their properties. In exchange for that, they will have paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah, jihad, so they kill and are killed. It is a true promise binding upon Allah in the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran. Now, do we have orders to make jihad in the Torah or in the Gospel now?
Not that I've ever seen, no.
Well, because Paul removed it, and Paul then said Christians must abandon the jihad. Didn't we see the scholars say that happened?
Yeah.
And this is why they make that claim, that the jihad was abandoned by Paul, because they couldn't find it. When eventually they found an actual Torah and an actual gospel, not the Gnostic versions, not the heretical versions, not the oral versions, an actual written copy, they realized the Quran was wrong.
Yeah. So they needed a backstory to explain away that
correct
disconnect, that contradiction. Yeah.
Correct. So they needed to do that. So, okay, so now I will move forward. So that's all I wanted to cover, just to provide some updates on that. And, okay, so... Oops, wrong. So let me just get back to where we ended off last time. So, okay, so we ended off with Paul of Samosata last time, which they confused. So some scholars claim that Paul of Samosata, Islamic scholars, claim that Paul of Samosata, who was the bishop of Antioch in 260. In 269, he was dismissed by a council of the priests of the day because of a heresy he created called the Paulinist heresy, the Pauline heresy, some might call it, which is a form of Unitarianism and adoptionism, where Jesus was a man who strived very hard, and therefore God made him his son. God elevated him to the divinity. And Unitarianism, in other words, he was not a Trinitarian. He was dismissed, and some Islamic scholars say that he was the first to have spoiled the religion of the Christians, exactly the same role attributed by other scholars and by the main polemic of Islam to St. Paul. So this is another confusion. Okay, so now let's continue with Shahrastani, another very well-known scholar. Okay, the milal wa-al-niḥal. So you can read more about it in with Edward Sell's book called The Faith of Islam, right? And also there's a chapter called Muhammad, a parody of Christ. Okay, Muhammad, a parody of Christ. And so the milal wa-al-niḥal is known as the Book of Sects and Creeds, and it's written by Muhammad al-Shahrastani, and he died in 1153, so middle of the 12th century. So Shahrastani says in his Kitāb al-milal wa-al-niḥal, which seems to be based on this tradition of safe. Should I go back over, or should I just mention briefly what this was, what the stories were, the claims that, or should I just continue, Mel?
Maybe just in a few words, if you can. It depends on how.
Okay, so the story is, so the general theme, there's multiple stories, but they seem to link to a central story developed in the 800s, right, in the 700s, but in the 8th century, by a man called Saif. Can't remember his name right now, but anyway, we'll get to him. So he develops the story whereby Paul is a Jew who fakes becoming a Christian to deceive to deceive the Christians and to destroy Christianity. And he was the king of the Jews. He then creates fake doctrine. He speaks to Nestor, who formed the Nestorian church. He speaks to Jacob, who formed the Jacobite church. And he speaks to Malcolm, who formed the Malkites. Now, of course, there was no Malcolm, because the Malkites just means the royalists. So there was no character called Malcolm. Yeah. Also, the Jacobites are from the 4th century, I believe, and the Nestorians are from the 5th century. So 400 years after Paul died. Yeah. So Paul had a time machine, as you can tell.
Yeah. Very ahistorical, yeah.
Extremely. Okay, so these scholars are making up stories, so that they're redacting stories back, clearly. They're making up these things. And so thus he creates 3 separate conflicting doctrines. In other versions of the story, he has 3 kings who visit him every year. He gives them conflicting versions of the story, and they all fight each other, they squabble, and what happens is Paul is responsible for splitting off Islam and Christianity. Christianity was Islam, but he split it off, and it became a separate religion. And he falsified, according to some versions, he falsified the Bible, he edited it. According to other scholars, he forced the misinterpretation of the Bible, that the Bible would lead to Islam. Okay, so there are different conflicting versions of the story, but many of these tales have certain common elements. Some of them are identical, some diverge in various elements. And I've been going through the scholars from the 8th to the 14th century, but where they have common stories and where they have, where they differ. Right. This is about the polemics against Paul, the negative stories, not the neutral to positive ones. Okay. So Shahrastani says that Paul changed the bases of the knowledge of St. Peter. So he corrupted Simon Peter, and he mixed Simon Peter's Gospels with arguments of the philosophers and Paul's own confused ideas. Right. And al-Shahrastani accuses Paul of corruption of the scriptures. Now, he says that which he has seen the epistle of Paul to the Greeks. And he doesn't mention, now again, in many cases, they are very, very vague in how they phrase these. He went to the land of the Romans. He went to the king. Which king? When? Right? So, Now let's have a look. Shahrastani. Now, Shahrastani is making these claims against St. Paul. However, let's have a look at what Shahrastani wrote about Muhammad. He writes here in his milal wa-al-niḥal, long before the creation of the world, Allah took a ray of light from the splendor of his own glory and united it to the body of Muhammad. So Muhammad is infused with the divine essence of Allah himself, saying to Muhammad, "Thou art the elect, the chosen. I will make the members of thy family the guides to salvation," which is taken straight out of the statement that God makes to Abraham. Right? And Muhammad then says, the first thing which Allah created was my light and my spirit.
So this is the 12th century, right? So this is like early 12th century. So this is around the time that the Crusaders are claiming that Mohammedans at that time are idolizing Muhammad. And some people dispute that. But here's some written evidence which would actually support that they are actually idolizing him. They're actually...
I can show you some more. If you go through the church archives and you go into some of the very old material on what happened and the inquisitions against the Crusaders, you'll start to find some very interesting statements of that nature. Yes.
Yeah. Very good.
So understand. So Shahrastani, this is what Shahrastani writes about Muhammad. So can we trust what he says about Paul? Right. So now, bad Christians sent Paul and the Romans. So just to recap from where we ended off. So other Islamic traditions now paint Paul as a cunning and roguish Jew out for mischief, and he assists mischief doers. He's a troublemaker, he's a power seeker, and he employs all kinds of tricks. Okay. However, in this version, a new version of the story, Paul's conversion to Christianity is genuine, but now the Jews want to kill him for it because he left Judaism. So now Paul runs to the Romans for protection. So now instead of Paul being a Jew that fakes becoming a Christian to destroy, and remember, Paul also commits suicide, right? To destroy the Christian faith, to leave squabbling people behind who've got all different information. But of course, there's the believer, who follows the true teachings of Jesus and eventually dies as a good Muslim after meeting Muhammad, right? But that's in part one. So due to the conflict with the Jews, Paul seeks protection from the Romans, and he goes to the Roman governor with the claim that he followed the religion of Caesar. Now tell me, in AD 60, were the Romans Christians? No?
No, it took another 200 or 300 years before that happened, yeah.
Correct.
Interesting.
So that's the amazing scholarship of our Islamic scholars, these Einsteins of the day. So he goes to the king of the Romans, okay? So he follows the religion of Caesar, the king of the Romans, and he had broken away from the Jewish religion. And thus, by doing so, he betrays the true religion of Jesus. How that connects, I don't know. It makes little sense to me, but that's the claim that is apparently made. So he does this not out of loyalty to the Jews, but he wants to gain prominence among the Romans and to incite them against the Jews out of revenge. So Paul's corruption of Christianity by introducing pagan Roman customs is basically a pro-Roman, anti-Jewish strategy to try to gain favor from the Romans for his own power and protection. Now, of course, it involves the abolition of circumcision, of the rules of ritual purity, and again, the food prohibitions, as well as changing the prayer direction. Now, on this point, I'm working on a different set of slides, a different narrative, which talks about where they got this whole story. And it does seem to come from a second century Gnostic gospel, which was then denounced by the church already, called the Book of al-fiṣal. There does seem to be a strong connection to that. Okay. However, the changing of the prayer direction, just briefly, is an issue whereby within the tradition, let me try and find if I have the notes here. Okay, no notes. So within the tradition of the church, what you have is that the altar used to face to the east in some cases, but the church, when it says we face the east, it just means we face the altar. Okay, so it just means to face the altar. So not necessarily literally to the east, but this is not something that is obviously within force within the church, but that's where they get that concept, right? Facing the east. So now.
I don't know if you're planning to refer to the book of al-fiṣal. I know you just referred to it there briefly.
No. In a different,
Another time. We'll
I'm just busy compiling notes. It's part of this thread. I'm working on a bunch of different things. These sources. I'm working on all of the sources of the Quran and all the traditions within Islam. I'm working on documenting and identifying all of the stories they tell and the original sources. So I'm working from numerous different angles on this. And
that's for another day. Yeah.
But it's all from Jewish folklore, children's tales. It's all from Gnostic tales, from apocryphal gospels. You can trace all of this stuff. It's none of it's original.
Okay.
Right. Now, Qadi al-Jabbar. Okay. Did you want me to mention that story about Gabriel?
Maybe just that, because I think that's a quite a gem and it's quite revealing.
Okay. So very briefly, Aisha mentions 2 hadith where she claims that Muhammad never met Allah. However, he did have Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, reveal himself in his full dimensions to Muhammad. There are 2 hadith to this effect. And Gabriel is so big that he blots out the horizon. He spreads across and covers the horizon. There are only 2 historical treatises or 2 historical accounts of an angel this massive. And the one is this these hadith from Aisha, and the other is a Gnostic text from the 2nd century, I believe, called the Book of al-Qasai, right, or al-Qasai, however it's pronounced. Now,
what a coincidence! What a coincidence! Yeah.
Yeah, and in this book, what you have is you have Gabriel, who's 96 miles tall. He's 24 miles across the shoulders. His feet are 14 miles long, 4 miles wide, and his footprints are 2 miles deep. So, and he blots out, he's so huge, he blots out the horizon, right? And also, in the Book of al-Qasai, he gives a man a holy book. An angel, in this case, gives a man a holy book. And then on top of that, in the book, they speak of circumcision is compulsory. And of course, Paul abandoned this teaching by abandoning the circumcision. And of course, the food rules are compulsory. And again, so in this case, there would seem to be a link to the Islamic adoption of these ideas, or insistence that these ideas are compulsory, versus what's in this particular. So this might be a source of the whole idea. So there's multiple sources. I mean, like the idea of Paul being squeezed in the cave. There are other sources that talk about that again. So I'm busy trying to pull all of these together. And so hopefully that clarifies that.
Thank you. Cheers. That's good.
Right. So Qadi ibn al-Jabbar, right, who died in 1025, okay, in his version, as discussed by a scholar called Pines and by Stern, German scholar, they present a detailed elaboration of this particular tradition of Paul. However, again, within Qadi al-Jabbar's version, he does not blame Paul for the emergence of the Trinitarian doctrines. So now you've got all of these different doctrines. So some scholars have portions of it. So the question is like, well, anyway, so we could ponder how they all got certain themes correct and how they missed others. Now, so in summary, the story of this Ibn Saif Umar al-Tamimi, his story is a confusion of elements from these traditions of Paul being a Jew, being a Christian, being the king, not being the king. And so there was this legend focused on the contradictory views of Islam and Christianity regarding the status of Jesus, right? So Paul is a Jew who fakes conversion to combat Christianity, right? So the Jew who fakes conversion is the basis, supposedly, seemingly, of this Saif's report, right? For more detail, please refer to the first episode. And a few elements of the other traditions, such as Paul's change of the Qibla, the abolition of the food prohibitions, were then interpolated, it seems. They come from another source. Paul's abolition of the jihad seems very specific to Saif Tamimi's story. But it gets dropped later because during the Reconquista, Christians were fighting. So therefore, the abolition of jihad story lost its credibility.
Yes, very good. Yeah.
Right. Now, Paul's conflict with the Jews and his connections with the Romans are completely left out in Saif's report, but is present in those of other major scholars. Right. Now, Saif and the believer. So the believer is integral to the story. This is the fourth person that Paul taught. However, this fourth person didn't buy Paul's story and went and ran off and so on. So even in versions in which Paul is not mentioned, this Muslim believer, this thread of this Muslim believer who stayed true to the teachings of Jesus, the Islamic teachings of Jesus, this remains in all the stories. The believer, however, does not figure in Abd al-Jabbar's version of the story. So he's left out. Now, the believer and his followers represent Islam and the belief in the continuity and uniformity of the theological preaching of all the prophets, including Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, which is a fundamental doctrine of the Quran. And of course, we know that they had to shore up that story because once in the 9th century, once the Bible was in Arabic and was being spread chapter by chapter, they started to realize there were flaws in the Islamic narrative. Make sense so far?
Yeah, sounds good.
So yeah, can I play this? This is a short story, just it's 3 minutes by Bart Ehrman.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Islam's favorite scholar. So I'll play this. It's 3 minutes, and I pause during it. And this way, I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but it's still useful to listen to.
I will try the big screen to see that.
Okay. Okay, let's play this.
If you had to line all the apostles up, I get the vibe that for you, Paul is the cornerstone of the whole story.
Well, the reason I think he is somewhat different from what a lot of people say. Some people say that Paul invented Christianity, and that can't be true because Paul was persecuting Christians before he became a Christian. And so if he invented Christianity, he would have had nobody to persecute. So that's not right. And it's
Can't hear you. Let's see.
So does that make sense, Mal? How could Paul be persecuting Christians if he invented Christianity?
Yeah, there's a bit of a contradiction there. Yeah.
Yeah, and Barnabas makes sense for once.
It's not right that he invented the idea that Jesus' death and resurrection brought about salvation, because that's what Christians were saying before him. The thing that made Paul really key, as I argue in this book, is that he realized that followers of Jesus, this Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people, followers of Jesus did not have to become Jewish. You could be a converted pagan and believe in Jesus and in the God of Jesus, but you didn't have to adopt the ways of Judaism. And
so, any comment on that, Mel?
No, I'm happy to continue on.
This realization made it possible for Christianity to move away from being a sect within Judaism to being a worldwide religion. And if that hadn't happened, then Christianity would have ended up with the kind of historical significance of other Jewish sects. And they'd be as historically significant as the Sadducees or the Essenes, which are groups that are important for historians of ancient religion, but they're not exactly the sorts of things people worry about these days. And so he made it possible for Christianity to become what it did, which is the dominant religion of the empire.
So on that point, we can hear then that Muslims were aware of the power of Paul in terms of how he had spread Christianity, his influence rather, and thus what's one of the reasons, again, they had to target Paul. Or continue.
Paul and Constantine were the two most significant converts in the history of Christianity. And it's an easy case to make with both of them, actually, because without Paul, you wouldn't have had Christianity as a worldwide movement. And Constantine, he was the emperor. This is like the emperor converted.
How do you get from Paul is sending a letter to Corinth, some guidance and instruction, perhaps even correction, to this is a message that should be embraced by the entire world for all of posterity? That's just, it blows your mind.
Well, yeah, probably would have blown his mind too. He certainly had a high view of himself and he had a high view of his authority, but the idea that people would look upon these occasional letters that he wrote as being, given by God, that's quite a shift. But it's because the early Christians who were deciding what is the right thing to believe and what are the right ways to behave, especially in the decades and centuries after Paul, they had to find some authorities to direct their actions and their beliefs. And they ended up saying Paul is the one who directs our actions. And so he takes on a kind of authority that he didn't have in his own day.
Okay, so I will end that there and move to part 2. So any comments from you, Mel?
No, I think it speaks for itself, really. Excellent clip and probably worth watching again and again, really.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Okay, guys, so now I will end up with, so now we're in part 2, recap, all right? So we're going to learn, and we have learned, how Muslim historians and scholars present Paul as a conspirator, and they claim that, 1, Paul was the king of the Jews, and they've confused Paul here directly with King Saul, the Benjaminite. How Christians followed Islam for 81 years after Jesus died. Right? Now, 81 years after Jesus died, I don't know if Paul was alive, but I don't know how he could have changed the religion 81 years after Jesus. That would mean that Paul was alive in the 2nd century. Wouldn't that be so, Paul?
Yeah, I think every time we need a time machine, I think we need to drink a beer or something. This could be a parlor game here.
This could be entertaining.
Yeah, I think we need a picture of a time machine each time something implausible comes in like that. Yeah,
you could bring yourself back on the screen. You don't have to maximize it anymore. So Paul was a wicked Jew who committed suicide to destroy Christianity, which is what King Saul did. Paul was a good Christian who influenced the Romans to destroy the Jews. So the scholars contradict each other. Of course, Christians never thought Jesus was divine. Paul falsely taught this. Okay, and this, of course, is consistent with the story of Paul of Samosata, right? The 3rd century Antioch bishop. Paul invented the concept and the doctrine of the Trinity, okay, which Bart Ehrman has just refuted for us. Paul is responsible for the Crusades. We're going to cover this today, and I can go into more depth if there's an interest, but this is to defend the lies of Paul and how Muslims saved Christ's true teachings. So 7 and 8 we will complete today, and we'll continue. So this is now the story of how Muslims explain away the loss of the original Bible, because in the Quran it's clear that a written source, now I'm busy working on another presentation covering this in detail, but Muslims obviously claim, they explain that there was a written source of supposedly the Gospels, the New Testament, and the Torah. And now they've got to explain, where are they? Where is this original uncorrupted Gospel and original uncorrupted Torah that the Muslims somehow failed to preserve? Because they've lost them, because the Quran heavily relies, and many tafsir heavily rely on the Bible to prove the Quran and the prophethood of Muhammad. So Quran 61:6 goes, Isa, son of Mary, right? O children of Israel, I am the messenger of Allah unto you, confirming the Torah before me, and giving glad tidings of a messenger to come after me, whose name is Ahmad, the praised one. So they claim that Jesus had a copy of the original Torah, which descended upon Moses 1,500 years before Jesus. The original Torah, they say, was lost when Jerusalem was destroyed. That would be 70 AD. And this is according to a claim by at least one scholar, Abu Ubaidah, in the year 636. Right? Now, they claim then that Jesus is not bringing, and this is numerous Muslim scholars, even today, you can find discussions on YouTube today, where Jesus is said not to be bringing a new way of life, Christianity. Jesus had come to confirm the Torah, okay, but not the Torah written 500 years after Moses by a rabbi called Ibrahim ibn Ezra. This is the Islamic claim. That, yeah, no?
No, that's fine. Carry on.
Now, the source of this claim, though, well, the best known source of this particular claim, because Muslims love to cling to people like Bart Ehrman and others who tend to support their claims, is a man called Baruch Spinoza, right? Is the most famous proponent of this particular claim. He was expelled basically from the Jewish community and the Catholic community. The church expelled him too. They both said he was heretical, right? He was a biblical critic, right? And Rabbi Ezra is considered one of the most distinguished Jewish biblical commentators and philosophers of the Middle Ages. And the Muslims claim that he rewrote the Torah after the Torah was lost. So with the destruction of Jerusalem, some of the Jews, the Messianic Jews, took the original Bible, ran off into the wilderness, no one knows, took the Bible with them, and thus the Bible was lost and a new one had to be written, and Rabbi Ezra rewrote it from scratch. So now, on the issue of continuity, now we go to al-Masudi and we get to Ibn Kathir, and we now start getting into the more modern, well-known scholars. Al-Masudi, he died in 956. He says, the people of the intermediate period between Christ and Muhammad were monotheists, and they professed the resurrection. So now you have monotheists, and when they use the word monotheist, that is code for Muslims. However, these professed the resurrection. So they did allude in previous stories to these Muslims who had heretical ideas. Now, Ibn Kathir identifies the followers of a man called Abdullah ibn Adius. And I have not been able to trace this man or trace this name. There's no evidence for this that I can find. None that I could trace at all. Who believed that Jesus was only a servant and a messenger of Allah. And they settled in deserts and wasteland. They built hermitages, monasteries and cells, and they lived an ascetic life. They did not mix with anyone else. And they believed in heretical Trinitarian doctrines and introduced innovations. Now, this is alluded to in the Saif story, when the followers of the believer escape to Palestine, when the other three groups fight them. Paul tells them, kill these guys because they won't believe me. They're fought, they escape to Palestine, and the Jews capture them. And then they tell the Jews, we just want to go live in the wilderness. Right? That's their story. So now this actually is a parallel to that previous retelling of the story. Now let's have a look at Ibn Kathir, Quran 31:13. They speak here of the town Antioch and those sent from Allah. So in this Quran passage, we've got the story that messengers were sent from Allah. So these, in other words, were believers in Allah, were people loved by Allah who were sent to Antioch. So let's look. So in Tafsir Ibn Kathir, we have, when we sent them two messengers, they denied them both. So they hastened to disbelieve them. We reinforced them with a third. We supported and strengthened them with a third messenger. Right? The names of the first two messengers were Simon and John. And the name of the third was Bulus, the Arabization of Paul, and the city was Antioch, Antakya. So that's in Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Let's have a look at what this has to say now. Ibn Kathir, who died in 1106, refers to Simon, John, and Paul. However, Ibn Kathir does consider it implausible that the city is Antioch, and modern Muslim apologists will use this argument today. They'll claim it's not Antioch because Antioch was historically a very strong Christian base. However, the Quran records the city in question as being destroyed for its unbelief. And the question is, could this have some connection to the 3rd century and Simon of Bulus al-Shumshati, Simon of Samosata? That's a question that may come up. Now, interestingly, there's a scholar called Ryan Spieß who notes that the origins of this tradition of Paul as one of the 3 messengers to Antioch is in the apocryphal Acts of Peter.
Another borrowing, yeah.
Yes. It seems to come from the book The Acts of Peter, another apocryphal or Gnostic gospel, right? And note, though, that Apostle Peter apparently is also accused very similarly to Paul. A good book on the history is A History of Muslim Views of the Bible, the First 4 Centuries by Martin Whittingham. Some good information to be found there. Now, let's have a look at Tabari, okay, who claims that Peter and Paul, their bodies were preserved in glass cases in Rome. So other scholars like Tabari now, they ignore this whole narrative by Saif, right? He mentions Paul relative to his arrival and crucifixion in Rome, together with Peter by the order of Emperor Nero. Now, let me just get to my notes because I know I'm going to come up with some notes now.
So he seems actually pretty historical there. You know, he hasn't gone, at least in terms of what you've said.
And also, he's not negative.
Yeah.
He mentions no negativity towards Paul. So Tabari is very positive, actually, relatively speaking. Now, Tabari's omission of all of Saif's work may explain the neutral to positive attitude towards Paul in other historical works. And don't forget, Tabari borrowed from Saif to write his books on the wars of apostasy and the conquests of Islam. Right? Now, Al-Masudi places the crucifixion of Peter and Paul in the days of Emperor Claudius. Now, briefly speaking, Emperor Nero was the 6th. He lived from 37 to 68 AD. He was the Roman emperor, right, who Paul appealed to upon return to Jerusalem after his 3rd missionary journey, right? Now, he's not mentioned by name in the Bible, but records, okay, and perhaps the book of Revelation identify him as a ruthless man who persecuted Christians. So that's Nero. But Claudius is the 4th Roman emperor. He succeeded Caligula in AD 41, okay, and he treated the Jews badly, right? And he was poisoned by his 4th wife, Agrippina, who was the mother of Nero. Okay, now, Masudi places the crucifixion of Peter and Paul in the days of Claudius, right, which is too early, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously that's historically wrong. And he identifies them as well with the 2 messengers sent to Antioch in Surah 17 of the Quran. And according to him, the bodies of Peter and Paul were put into crystal glass cases in which they were preserved in various churches in Rome until this day. So Mel, are you familiar with this, with the idea?
Well, I am familiar with the idea that the relics, well, at least some bones of Peter and Paul have been preserved in Rome in crystal glass cases. I don't know where they've got that from. Yeah. But so, I don't think they ever had the bodies. I think all they had, as far as I know, is just a few bones, a tiny few bones of Peter. I'm not sure about Paul.
Yeah.
But
now, so let's look at Tabari again. Tabari's History, Volume 4, page 123 and 127, called The Story of Jesus. Now, Tabari tells us that Jesus has 2 natures, and maybe after the Assumption. He says here that Jesus was both human and angelic, celestial and terrestrial, which is a very interesting claim. And the apostles dispersed as commanded, and so on and so on and so on. And he mentions the apostle Peter and Paul, who was a follower, not an apostle, which would be accurate.
Yeah.
Paul was not an original.
Yeah, seems very fair there.
However, he does call Jesus both human and angelic, both celestial and terrestrial. He does say that Jesus has 2 natures.
Yeah.
And then, of course...
sorry to cut across. Do you think, is he using the word angelic to kind of just come short of saying divine? Is that his way of...
So. Because you see, because Muhammad is superior to Jesus. Jesus goes to the 2nd heaven. So Jesus becomes an angel, which is one of the lower beings, but Muhammad goes to the 7th heaven.
Right, yeah.
Right, so Muhammad's of a higher nature, yeah. So now Nero ruled for 14 years, he says, and he slew Peter, beheaded Peter, and he crucified Paul head down in Tabari.
That sounds a little bit like he's got the 2 of them mixed up there.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. Peter's head down. Wow. That seems a very schoolboy error for someone that's acknowledged as a fairly decent historian by Muslims, at least.
Now, that would lead one to think that what other errors have they made? because these errors are constant across these.
Yeah. Like that's probably like if you were learning about Christianity, I think that's probably one of the earliest, simplest things that you would learn. Peter got crucified upside down. I don't know how he could have made such a mistake unless that there was a motive to get it all mixed up and muddled. I don't know.
Who knows? I mean, so look, I'm offering evidence here that needs to be investigated. Things that need further investigation. Now, Masudi, al-Jawzi, and Peter and Paul. So Masudi says, but most of those who occupy themselves with the history of the world think they were killed during the reign of the 5th Emperor Nero. So he's now debating when they were killed. It's well known it's Nero, but now Masudi is saying, well, we think it was during the time of Nero. Al-Masudi, he identifies Paul as well with the third messenger sent by Allah to Antioch. Right, so he confirms the story by Ibn Kathir. Ibn al-Jawzi, who died in 1200, identifies Paul as one of the 2 messengers also described in Surah 36. So now you've got further corroboration of Paul being sent to Antioch as a confirmed messenger of Allah. No negativity towards him. Right, and then the crucifixion on Peter and Paul is also mentioned without additional negative views by other historians, including another famous one called Ibn al-Athir as late as 1232.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to just the previous point about, the Paul and Peter sort of error. I wonder is part of the agenda that they are spreading errors in relation to them to suggest actually that Christians have got it distorted and wrong. So by offering alternative takes on very common elements, it's part of their agenda to basically say the Christians have got it all muddled and it's distorted. It doesn't matter what it's about.
Yeah, I think this would be part of their intention. I would certainly say so. To cause confusion. Yeah, I would have to back you on that.
And who is it that says Satan is the father of confusion? So I have to say there's an element there.
Fair point. But yeah, I mean, so there's all of these narratives. Now look, I'm showing snippets, but clearly these guys were writing full polemics.
Yeah.
Right. So now in the 11th century, let's go back to Ibn Ḥazm. Let's go back to Saif's influence on Ibn Ḥazm. So this is the grandfather of this whole tale. He is not the instigator, but he's certainly the guy who established it as the standard narrative. Right. So Ibn Ḥazm, again, in his famous Kitāb al-fiṣal, one of the things we have heard related by the Jews, their scholars, without anyone denying it, boils down to the following. Their rabbis, on whose authority the Christians have adopted their religion, the Torah as well as the books of the prophets, agreed to bribe Paul the Benjaminite. May Allah curse him. They ordered Paul, the king, to profess outwardly the religion of Jesus and to deceive his followers and to induce them to follow the doctrine of Jesus' divinity. They told him, we shall take upon ourselves your sin. And he was extremely successful, Paul, as is generally known. Now notice, they told him, we shall take upon ourselves your sin. This is exactly the statement that the rabbis make to Pontius Pilate. When Pontius declares Jesus innocent, and the rabbis then state, look, we have a law. I think it's John 19:21. They say, we have a law, and according to our law, he has claimed to be the Son of God, and he must die. And we take the sin upon us.
So am I understanding right? So instead of this being said to Pontius Pilate, it's been said to Paul. Is that right?
Yes.
Am I following?
Yes, because Paul is king.
Yeah.
Paul
yes. King. So Paul has essentially taken the position of Pontius Pilate in their story.
It seems to be a repurposing of that tale. Yeah, because they're attacking details. They're attacking specific details. Remember, where does Jesus say he's God? They have to attack specific areas of Paul's doctrine because Paul established, we'll get into that a little bit, but Paul established a certain doctrine. Paul puts forward the most powerful apologetic for Christianity, the most powerful, because Paul was a great legal mind as a Jewish scholar, he was a great intellect. Yeah, right? He was in line to become the next grand rabbi, the next chief rabbi. So they had to find a way to undermine major parts of Paul's doctrine.
Yeah,
in this case, does that make sense that they would attack these things?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Very good.
So now moving on, right? So Ḥazm condemns Paul's deceit of the Christians as immoral, right? Now, I'm not a Christian, shall we say, evangelist, and I'm not an apologist. So my knowledge of Islam, and especially Islamic law, is way better than my knowledge of the Bible. So someone else would have to decode exactly what he means by all of this. So I'll leave that to you, Mal, and others. But Ibn Ḥazm says, it is a thing which we do not consider unlikely to have been committed by the Jews, this deceit. because they intended to do the same with us and with our religion, even though it was impossible for them to reach their goal in this case. Remember, a Jew created a division within Christianity and split Christianity off from what was originally Islam, but a Jew also created a split which forced the Shia-Sunni split. So they blame that upon a Jew, and now they blame the same thing upon a Jew. In Christianity, this happened when Abdullah ibn Saba, known as Ibn al-Sauda, the Jew, the Himirite, may God curse him, converted to Islam with the purpose of deceiving as many Muslims as he could. They love their conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And in fact, the evil Jew of this narrative induced a contemptible group of partisans of Ali to profess Ali's divinity, just like Paul had suggested the idea of the divinity of Christ to the Christians. These partisans of Ali are the Batiniya and Khaliya to this day. The least unbelieving of them are the Imamiyya. May Allah curse them all. That's the words of Ibn Ḥazm. Now, Ibn Ḥazm says, according to the Christians, Paul had prohibited circumcision, one of the firmest legal prescriptions of the Torah. Okay, and he discusses what he calls the epistles of Paul, for which he apparently had Arabic translations. Your comments, Mel?
Just a quick reminder of the date for Ibn Ḥazm again.
Died 1064.
Say it again?
Died 1064.
1064, right, okay. Just trying to kind of, because was that him that referred to the Shia there a second ago in the previous slide? Okay, because one of the questions that I have, and in fact, I see Muir is in the audience as well, but one of the questions I have is the very first mention of Sunni and Shia and trying to get back to the origin of that. So this might be a little bit of a help in terms of pushing that back as early as possible. But that's a side sort of thought.
There may well be other mentions as well, because the earliest mention is by Ibn Sayf al-Umar al-Tamimi, right? And that goes back to the 8th century, to the late 700s. So that claim of a Jew causing the split between the Shia and in fact, Sayf wrote the story, this whole polemic against Paul, right? He wrote it because he says, look, this Jew has now caused the split between Islam and Christianity, because Christianity should have been Islam, and a Jew did it to us before as well. So we need to unite and come back together and all be Muslims.
So do you think that was? Do you think there was some historical event that he's recalling and using that as a rhetoric about Paul? Do you think that's the case, or is it just
he was writing? So Sayf Umar al-Tamimi was writing in reference to the assassination of Uthman, I believe, or Umar, one of them. He was writing so he was trying to now create unity, and he was claiming, so his polemic was to say basically it's the Jews causing this, we need to get back together or something like that.
Okay, right.
Does that help you?
Yep, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Hey, Murad.
Yeah.
Hey, Murad, I see your message. Thank you. We should talk sometime.
Yes,
okay, now. So Ibn Ḥazm ridicules Paul's views on circumcision. He says the cursed Paul says in one of his epistles. Now, I hate the vagueness in their statements. They're never precise, right? They always lack the specificity, right? The one to the Galatians in the 6th chapter, we testify to every man who has been circumcised that he's obliged to keep the laws of the Torah completely. However, somewhat earlier, he writes, if you are circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. How strange that he apparently prescribed two different religions to them, he writes. Then he goes on. Oh, my bad. I need to fix that. Give me one. I made another wrong mistake here. Yeah. I was busy checking. Okay, there we go.
Is that claim that he just made there, is that accurate, or is it a false claim?
No, these are his words. So he's basically saying, remember Paul says that, Paul does mention in Galatians that if you want to live by the law, then you have to keep the whole of the law. And this will be impossible for you. Okay, you can't pick and choose. But he says that you have salvation if you believe in Christ, right? Yeah. Which is much easier, which is given by grace. So he's now I don't know, he's doing a clever sort of word game thing against that whole thing. He's trying to pick that Galatians argument apart.
Yeah. I think where he's either got it wrong or he's misleading people is that he's not appreciating that the liturgical laws, the laws, for example, to do with circumcision and the like, they're now defunct if there's now salvation through Christ. So now we've got a totally different we've got totally different. What's the word? Well, I'm going to say liturgical laws.
There's different covenants.
Different covenants. So therefore, that's a fake argument. Paul isn't talking about. Paul is talking about perennial laws that are still relevant, that are eternal, essentially, because circumstances haven't changed.
On this point, there are different covenants through the Bible, right, which have a time, a geography, and a person attached to them, or a group. However, Paul had to, without going into too much depth here, the dietary laws are binding on the nation of Israel, right? The laws of circumcision are binding on the children of Abraham, on the line of Abraham, right? So biblically, as far as I know, the law of circumcision is binding on the line of Abraham. Paul was the apostle to the pagans, and therefore those rules were not binding on the pagans, and he did not want them to become Jews. The point was to become a separate religion, but certainly all of those apostles in the day had a Jewish background, and you cannot separate them from their Jewish culture, right? However, don't forget, the Jews were following the Mosaic law and the Abrahamic law and other covenants that were still binding upon them. However, and this is where people would probably lose their minds, if Paul was a trained rabbi and a trained Jew who knew the Jewish law, then he would know that the pagans are only supposed to be following the laws of Noah, which some people call the covenant of Noah, which some people call a conspiracy theory. However, the laws of Noah are 5 or 6 of the make up, literally, I mean, word for word, half of the laws of Noah. Sorry, there are 7 laws of Noah, and 6 of them are found in the 10 Commandments. So those who claim that the laws of Noah are a conspiracy theory by the Jews to kill everybody would then have to say that 6 of the laws of the 10 Commandments are evil and are designed to kill everybody.
No, that's nonsense.
So so Paul would know that only at the basic level those laws of Noah are binding, which basically they're a precursor to the 10 Commandments. So Paul would know that just that is binding, and thus they now had to exegete Jesus' words and apply them. And on that basis, he said, look, for the Gentiles, these are the laws. Those are for the Israelites. These are for the Gentiles. Right. So I will move on. He goes on to say, the person who is circumcised is obliged to keep the laws of the Torah, but Christ will profit him nothing. However, Christ will indeed profit the uncircumcised, although he is not obliged to keep the laws of the Torah. So he's the forefather of the didatisms that we have to deal with today.
So he's he's trying to suggest Paul is contradicting himself, but he doesn't appreciate that actually there are real distinctions going on. St. Paul is responding to
it's a deliberate polemic. But understand, we've just showed that look, it is obligatory for Muslims to utilize deceit to defend Islam. Right. And we've shown that their form of debate, their form of rhetoric is deceitful. It's a strategy of war. It's designed to win. It's not designed to find truth. It's designed to convince. In fact, if you look at adab, and I mentioned the words hiyal and adab and others, if you look at the secondary meaning of madhab, the schools of jurisprudence, if you look at their secondary meaning, it's also persuasion. It falls under adab as well. These are schools of persuasion. They were the foremost successful persuaders.
Right. Okay.
They fall under the same definition, which means they were not seeking truth; they were just persuasive.
And I'm just thinking of it's almost like adaptation in the environment. The ones that are the most successful are kept. The ones that didn't work to persuade others are dropped. So this is the way Islam works. It basically tries out these arguments, finds what works, keeps those ones, and are happy to change them if need be, if circumstances change, like what you mentioned in Spain when the Christians had to fight and so on. So there's no obligation to keep to the truth. It's whatever works at this particular moment in time.
That is called rukhsa. That is called that is called dispensation, or there's a few names for it. I can't remember the other name that's more appropriate. But Islam has 2 main obligations. So there are 2 main doctrines, rather. Let's call them doctrines. There are 2 main doctrines, azima and rukhsa. Azima is strict adherence to the Sharia. This is where a few of the Muslims, this small minority, must perform Islam as it is written, as it is required. to the letter, right? And thus is the jihadi who takes the truck and drives through a Christmas market. He is following azima. He's following strict Islam, strict Sharia. At the end times, at the end of the day, azima must be binding upon all Muslims. All Muslims must switch to azima. However, the rest of the Muslims, you see, as long as some Muslims are performing Islam strictly according to azima, the rest are absolved of having to follow strictly, and thus they can do what's called rukhsa. Rukhsa is dispensation, a relaxation of the laws. Now, under rukhsa, so what you have azima, very strict, then you have rukhsa. Under rukhsa, you have various other doctrines like tawriyat, mudarat. You have, actually no, those are forms of deceit, but you have taysir and darura, for instance. Taysir is ease and necessity. So Muslims are allowed to not follow, and these are part of doctrines of deceit, right? They fall under the doctrines of deceit, but they're allowed to not follow the law strictly because it would bring attention to them, and negative attention, or simply to get along. However, at any time they could switch into azima. You never know. There are certain rules binding upon them, in which case they must switch over to azima. And thus they're able to violate the rules, because also there are many reasons why but they're allowed to relax these rules.
Yep.
Right. Now, Ibn Ḥazm on Galatians 2. Now, Paul and the other disciples were circumcised according to the unanimous Christian view, he says. It follows that Christ did not profit them, while they were bound to keep all the laws of the Jews. Since most
sorry, can I just point out that's another time machine again? So, presumably Paul was circumcised long before, he converted to Christianity. So this is another time machine thing going on here.
So, and Ibn Ḥazm is regarded by Western scholars as he's lauded, and they fawn over him as a great scholar. I mean, so maybe they look at his views on mathematics. I don't know, 1 + 1 = 2. I guess that great, he got it right. He could tie his shoelaces without tripping and falling over. Fantastic. But when you look at his views on this man is humiliating himself.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know what does he expect Paul to do, to go and get some surgery and uncircumcise himself? Like, what's
because the Jews now,
makes no sense.
Interesting. Correct. And Jews are circumcised on the 8th day according to the Jewish law. Now, according to the Sirah, Muhammad was born circumcised, just so you know. Yes.
It's convenient.
Yes, because he is superior to the Jews, don't you know? He's superior to Jesus. Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day. Muhammad was born circumcised.
Oh, yeah.
So now he says, since most Christians now living among the Muslims are circumcised, it follows, is that true? It follows that if you were speaking the truth, Christ does not profit them. Okay?
Well, that's factually incorrect. But of course, he can get away with that because short of pulling everyone's trousers down, there's no way you're going to know one way or the other. It's just a daft argument.
Yeah. And he says then, if Paul lied concerning this matter, how could they then accept the teachings of their religion from a liar? Yet one of these possibilities must be true. So he presents this argument. This is his argument, and this has become standard across the centuries now.
That is unbelievable. That is such a weak argument. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Paul and the other disciples were so let me see. Okay. Now, interesting. Why Galatians? Why attack Galatians? Well, let's make a short point here. Paul says in Galatians 1:8-9, even if we are an angel, if an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel other than what we have preached to you, a curse be on him.
So that's the issue. They have to throw him under the bus, because there's no way to overcome that for Islam. That's a permanent block.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So all of these, I'm trying to get to the root source. It's bugged me for a long time. What is the root source of their animus towards Paul? And I think I've basically unlocked it from every angle that I could think of within their earliest sources. And Paul wrote these words 600 years before Muhammad, known as the mad poet in the Quran, even experienced his strangulation encounter with Jibreel in the cave of Hira. And they needed to undermine this passage.
Yeah. No, that makes good sense. Yeah.
Okay, now let's move on to Qurtubi. Okay, Qurtubi, this guy, his stuff, it's very hard to find his works because this guy the words just come out of his mouth and he calls it a spade. But it's extremely hard to find his work in English. It's really impossible. I've got very little of his stuff, but what I have is useful. includes Saif's complete story in the second introduction to the third chapter of his anti-Christian polemic, which is devoted, again, like all the others, to the establishment of Muhammad's prophethood. And he states that the story is found in the historical books preserved by us and them. But do they have these books? No. And he says that Paul's third vision leading to the abolition of the Christian jihad by his followers is left out of his book. Right? And during the Reconquista, with all the battles between the Muslims and the Christians, this vision had lost its credibility. But notice the influence. Muslims still claim that we're supposed to be peaceful and turn the other cheek, because this is in Saif's story. Sound familiar?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So they're trying to pull us up because Saif had said it, the expectations that we're meant to be obliged to follow that, even though that's never been part of the agenda.
So so it's become part of the culture. It's endemic in the culture, even though it's not known. But Saif's story actually has influenced the Islamic perception of Christianity and their polemic against us.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the believers in Qurtubi, when he speaks of this group called the believers, they also flee to Arabia, where 30 of their monks eventually meet Muhammad and die as Muslims. So this concurs with that story. Okay, this took place, but Allah knows best. Did I show you the Aqidah on Allah knows best? Did I show that? The Islamic creed.
Don't remember if you did or not.
Okay, this might be worth a diversion, and I should finish this within reasonable time. Let me show you this. Okay, this is called. Let's see. Bugger. Give me a sec. Maximize. Okay, so this is called, now, just as we have the Nicene Creed, Muslims have what's called the Aqidah. There's different ones, okay? This one's a very popular one called the Aqidah al-Tahawiyah, okay? And they have basic tenets of Islam, basic beliefs that all Muslims must share, like Allah is one with no partners, nothing happens except what Allah wills, all the predestination stuff, and etc., etc. He creates without his being in need to do so, blah, goes on and on. This is basic beliefs in Islam. Okay, the fundamentals of faith, like we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. Okay. However, tenet number 75, can you read that for me, Mel? Tenet number 75.
When our knowledge about something is unclear, we say Allah knows best. Oh, that's so convenient. Yes. That's the get out of jail card there, just there.
Yeah, it's actually part of their creed. It actually goes back to that's actually, they are taught to say this when they're young already.
Wow, that's incredible.
So that's an admission of ignorance. Yeah. Now, that's in their creed. Just like, imagine the Nicene Creed says, when we don't know, we got to say, well, Jesus knows best.
Actually, the Christian church could have not bothered with some of those councils that they had trying to decide on the creed. They could have just said, God knows best, and just left it at that, But
there you go.
We decided we're going to define it.
Exactly. So, right now, he says this took place, but Allah knows best, about 40 years after Christ. So 40 years after, that's around the year 70. That's about the time. And again, they're tying this to the time of the destruction of the temple. So they're saying that these guys might have taken. I'm sure the implication is that these guys might have taken the original Bible with them, the original Torah scrolls. And consequently, the whereabouts of the believer and his followers continued to be concealed, whereas the followers of the other sects remained divided but intermingled. Their situation was not consolidated until the time of the Emperor Constantine, he says. And he pays attention to the practical and the ritual side of Christianity, and he explains why the religion of the Christians is often contradictory to the teachings of Jesus. That's in his polemic. And he reminds his reader that Paul changed their Qibla and he abolished the dietary laws. And the abolition of circumcision is blamed, however, on Constantine. Did Constantine abolish circumcision?
No, absolutely not.
So another one of the giants of Islam.
Wow, without any respect for the norms of history, or if there's, where is the evidence that he's offering for this claim? But of course, this will be rehashed, and if you dare say no, actually, there's no historical basis of that, it's kind of like, well, prove it, But actually, the burden of proof is on Qurtubi, if that's how you pronounce his name, Qurtubi. Yeah. The burden of proof is on him, but he hasn't offered any evidence for that.
Correct. So now let's look at al-Qarafi. We're almost done. So he views Paul as an imposter and a cheat who spread Trinitarian beliefs and sowed discord amongst the Christians. So there was a whole factory of propaganda that was churning out these things. This was considered like a religious duty, right?
Yeah.
And it's and these narratives are mentioned in a section on circumcision, where he claims that all Christians used to be circumcised until the time of Paul, who forbade this practice and was like the devil to them. And he writes, this cursed Paul was the first to corrupt the religion of the Christians after they had professed the unity of Allah. So Christians were Muslims until Paul came along.
Yeah,
and he changed the foundations of their laws and altered the system of their rules concerning circumcision, among others. And he was the originator of the confession of Trinity, which arose from his evil view. But he blames Paul and not Constantine again.
Yes, interesting. They can't seem to make up their minds, though, who to blame the Trinity on. You know, some want to say Constantine invented it, and others want to say St. Paul that came up with it.
Right.
But,
and yeah, so look, if you read the different Islamic scholars, for instance, on the resurrection narrative, you're going to find that it's laughable, some of the stories. I mean, they're hysterically funny, but none of them can make up their mind as to what happened with the resurrection. Sorry, not the resurrection, the crucifixion narrative, where Jesus was in Islam, where he ascends into heaven. They can't make up their minds either. It's a real joke.
Yeah. Pretty good.
Right. So those stories are all over the place as well. And so it's a real laugh when you read them. Now, Al-Qaisi, 14th century. So now Paul causes the Crusades, and these are the last few slides and we'll be done. So now he presents Saif's narrative as illustrative of the historical causes of the divisions among the Christians. That's in his narrative, right? And he explicitly states the story is derived from the 5th volume of the Diwan of Saif ibn Umar al-Tamimi on the authority of Ibn Abbas. Right, so now he's got a direct link that this story from the 14th century, this reaches back to the 700s.
Yeah.
Right, and just as in Al-Qurtubi, Paul's third vision of jihad is omitted. Don't forget, this is after the Crusades. And what is very interesting is that if you read, for instance, the greatest historian, if you read the Muqaddimah by, who wrote the Muqaddimah now again? It just suddenly slipped my mind. Islam's supposedly greatest historian, he does not mention that the Christians were responsible. He says the Muslims were responsible, which is very interesting.
For the Crusades, or what do you mean?
Yeah, he says that the Muslims were responsible and the Christians were just acting in defense.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, you should look at some of that. Now, he deals with inconsistencies that he claims and improbabilities of the Gospels. And he says that among the Christians, there was a group of friars called the Temple, who were a remnant of the believers. These are the Muslims who took the true teachings of Jesus, and they continued into the 14th century. And they were supported by, and they served the temple, and they preserved clerical rule, and they took a remnant of the donations. They made some money. They were very wealthy. They considered themselves monotheistic, and they doubted Muhammad's message. Now, this is a little murky here because it's kind of inconsistent. Either I got it wrong or whatever, or the story is wobbly, right? Now, he teaches that the temple taught that the true religion was the unity of Allah, that Jesus was the messenger and servant of Allah, and that the beliefs of the Christians were heresy, right? So this is, and in 709 AH, after Hijrah, the priests and the clerics became suspicious and began to investigate and spy upon the members of the temple, and discovered that their leader and their representative had converted to Islam. And after a religious dispute, the leader handed over a letter in which he defended the friars, this group. They defended themselves by saying, you know, what we're doing is right, because you guys are following false Christianity, we are following the right one. And he explained their pure monotheistic belief, which was in conformity with Islam. And the letter went to the Pope in Rome, who opened it secretly. And the letter started with the Islamic Bismillah and the usual eulogy about the Prophet. And this letter accused the Christians of following the mendacious teachings of Paul, the Jew, and abandoning the teachings of the Imams and Jesus. So now all of the apostles are imams. And the Pope informed his inner circle about the contents of the letter, and he hid it in his ark. Now the Pope has an ark. So the Pope dies, and shortly afterwards the ruler of France discovers this letter, and he was outraged that no one had informed him about it. He summons the priests, and he tells them about this letter. And the King of France says, by God, this is what Jesus had promised us. The Muslims will inevitably appear from the Arabian Peninsula and from the whole of al-Andalus, Spain. They've discovered the truth of our religion, how we falsified the religion, and are well informed about our secret, that we are following fake Christianity and should have been Muslims by implication. Since these letters testify that no one but Allah should be worshipped, expel the friars, get rid of them, right? Because I fear they will let in the Muslims who will find out that these friars are monotheists and then destroy the country. I will send for the ruler of Portugal, the knights, the common men, and the rulers of Castile and Aragon in order to form a coalition against this people and expel the friars, the Jews, and the Muslims, and send them to the land of the Muslims to seize the land of the Muslims, and their land will become ours. By the land of the Muslims, they mean Jerusalem. Thereupon he expelled the Jews from his land and confiscated the friars' wealth and possessions. They took a solemn oath to expel the Muslims and to baptize the Mudajars. I'm not sure who that group is. Now, an army is recruited from Europe. They gather on the coast of Barcelona, and Don Jaime, the leader of the Crusades, also asked for assistance from the ruler of Majorca, and the Catalonian noblemen joined the troops, and they set off to fight the Muslims. This is this little. So far, how does that make sense to you, Mel?
Yeah, I'm trying to investigate even some of the claims. I was actually just looking up when friars actually began as a movement, just to check. I was actually thinking fact checking,
right?
So it's 12th, 13th centuries when the friars started. So that part seems okay.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I haven't been able to follow everything you've said there. I'm a little bit lost.
Now, the author identifies the Templars as the remnant of the believer in Sykes' story, right? And the events he refers to can be historically verified. So the expulsion of the Jews from France took place on July 22nd, 1306. The initiative for the persecution and dissolution of the Templars was taken by the French king in 1307. Clement V overcame his opposition, and initially he didn't want to believe the stories about the Templars, and he agreed to cooperate in the investigation after rumors about the Templars' heretical views began to spread. Clement V dissolved the order during the Council of Vienna in 1312, and rumors spread about the Templars linking them with the Muslims. And after the Templars' arrest, it seems that several of them entered into the service of the Sultan of Granada. During their interrogation, a few indications of some form of crypto-Islam came to light in the Templars. And many witnesses, okay, and people claim that all of them were tortured. This is not the case. Very few were actually tortured. Across Europe, they were simply questioned. And many told the very same story in different countries at different times, right, without having been connected to each other, right? And many witnesses report a secret ceremony in which Christ was abjured. One of the members of the order interrogated denied the belief in Christ, saying he had asked, "In whom should I believe?" Then, and the answer was in the one great God whom the Muslims worship. This phenomenon in the order of the Templars can be explained by assuming that they were Muslim captives, slaves in the order, who were freed after having been baptized. I mean, this is just hypothesizing. This is purely hypothetical. Many Muslim captives did serve in the order, and in fact, Salahuddin was allowed into the Templar order. Salahuddin, the enemy of the Jews, the enemy of the Christians, right, in the Holy Land, was allowed into the Templar order.
Who's making these claims? Is this the
Casey?
Casey's making this claim, but this is like really is. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I understood it right.
Yeah, so 14th century Al-Casey, the author of the source, was associated with the Order of the Templars during his long captivity in Christian Spain. Yeah. This would explain his interest in what. Now, look, there's a lot of speculative stuff here, but he does link to some degree. But he is now saying that the Templars became Islamic. Now, however, the evidence, when you look into it, the evidence does seem to bear that out, that the Templars converted to Islam, Sufi Islam, in fact, Sufism, that they became Islamic mystics. The evidence does point in that direction. If not all of them, certainly amongst the upper echelon.
I don't know if I've believed that, because my reading of it was that they were what you call the King of France wanted to get rid of them because they were too much of a power struggle. Certainly,
those are. But then again, that matches with the defense of them. That's like the way to try and defend and to. Can I go? Let me just finish this, and I'll answer that question. I'll show you some other evidence. Right? Okay. Finally, last slide. Gospel of Barnabas. In the Gospel of Barnabas, Paul is just in error. He's deceived, but he's not a ruthless con man. He's not a conspirator. He's not a deceiver working on behalf of the Jews or against the Jews, as the Islamic sources say. Now, this is also, unfortunately, a fake documentation of the Gospel of Barnabas, right? Possibly it's 15th, 16th century, maybe later, right? But there's a very different sentiment in the Gospel of Barnabas, and the errors of Paul are just reluctantly admitted to, even though, so there's some parallels, but the general atmosphere is very different. And I can go into some of the issues with the Templars. I'll cover some of that if you want. But I'll pause here for the moment and let you say if you have anything to add.
Yeah. So, yeah, what I'm trying to, it's been a lot of material. I'm trying to take it in, but it sounds to me like the different scholars down through the generations have been attacking Paul in whatever way they saw fit to destroy him. And this is simply because the key thing that they objected to is this. St. Paul made that statement that if even if an angel came with an alternative gospel, he is to be cursed. That closes the door to the possibility of Islam. It's the killer argument against Islam that there is no open door for a third revelation. That's essentially the problem with St. Paul's teaching. He has closed the door. He said, right, the public revelation ends here with Christianity. That's it. There's no opening. So they obviously have to disparage him in every way possible. I think this attack on the Crusaders, I think, is just another.
Can I show some evidence?
I think it might be just another way of attacking.
There's another aspect
Christianity, maybe.
Now,
there might be some
Christian, someone called the Unitarian Christian, which makes him a heretical Christian, in fact, a non-Christian. Yeah. He writes, the kings of France had the Templars killed because he owed them money and needed to fund a war. Now that is the common, shall we say, the common apologetic. Yeah. Now, do you mind if I just make a quick diversion and we look at some other evidence?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. I will need to probably go in a few minutes.
Okay.
Simply, but if that's okay.
I'll run through this as fast as I can. So,
but take as much time as you need. Okay. Sorry.
Modern scholars agree that the name of Baphomet was an old French corruption of the name Muhammad, with the interpretation being that the Templars, through their long occupation of the Middle East, had begun incorporating Islamic ideas into their belief system, and this was seen and documented by the Inquisitors as heresy. Now, in fact, you've got a 1235 source that says that a Saracen Islamic idol is called Baphomet. Now, remember, you said in that period they were worshipping Muhammad as an idol.
Yeah.
Now, there's evidence of that from the European side as well. A chronicler of the First Crusade, Raymond of Aguirre, called mosques Bafumarias. So this is the goat of Mendes, known as Baphomet. Now, there are different forms of it. Some are more complete, some are less complete. This is their common modern version, the more modern version that's become popularized. But we've got another author in his book, The Knights Templar, says in the trial of the Templars, one of the main charges was their supposed worship of a heathen idol head known as a Baphomet. And of course, Baphomet being Muhammad. Now, St. John of Damascus calls the Saracens from the Saracenoi, destitute of Sarah, who worship the morning star and Aphrodite. In their own language, they called Kabar, which is Khubr. I've been to that part of the world a few times, which means the great, the Kabirun, the great in size or dignity, right? So you've got St. John of Damascus confirming that the Saracens are the Muslims, right? They are descended from Agar, but call themselves the descendants of Sarah to hide their servile origin, right? That's in ecclesiastical history, blah, blah, blah. Moving on. Now, Oxford English Dictionary, you may have heard of this. Baphomet, the name Muhammad, used by medieval writers, the name of the idol which the Templars were accused of worshipping. The great stress and the condemnation of Templars is in the worship of Baphomet. Now, notice Leviticus, it says they must no longer offer their services to the goat idols to whom they prostitute themselves. Now, again, these guys are basically violating the laws. They are defying God. Now, some other scholars, okay, you look at some of the top scholarship that's available on the subject. Nicolai argued against the identification of the mysterious Baphometus or Baphomet and Muhammad, which implied that the Knights Templar had been converted to Islam and were worshipping a kind of Muslim idol. He was convinced of the Gnostic beliefs of the Knights Templar. Now, I can show you explicitly. Islam calls itself explicitly, with no ambiguity, a Gnostic religion. The Islamic scholars admit to being Gnostics. This is not a secret. They admit explicitly in the Sharia. It is not. There's no ambiguity at all. And just to Gnosticism,
just to challenge this a little bit. Ralph of Cain talks about during the First Crusades, they come across an idol on the Temple Mount of Muhammad, and he describes it in great detail. But he does also describe how they destroyed it. They dragged this thing out. It took, I think it was 6 or 7 people, maybe it's more, to drag it out, and they smashed it apart. So, but maybe that's the early days. So it's possible that they got corrupted over time. Maybe.
So
possible.
The Sufis claim that the Sufis do claim in their writings that they are the original Freemasons, that they took Freemasonry to England in the 12th century, I believe, and they also claim that through the Knights Templar, they secretly smuggled Freemasonry into Scotland, the 33rd degree right, in the 14th century. This is a claim made by the Sufis. Okay? So in the encyclopedia...
Just to put it in context, Freemasonry officially started in 717, so this is suggesting that the Sufis are suggesting that it came, what would that be, 300 years before, and it was secret for 300 years before it officially came out of the woodwork.
So they claim that the Sufis claim to be the original Freemasonry, that they have the secrets that Western Freemasonry has lost. And they smuggled it into Scotland in the 14th century through the Knights Templar, right? Now, in the Encyclopedia of Occultism, we've got Baphomet, the go title of the Templars. Baphomet was a head. Baphomet is a pantheistic and magical figure of the absolute, okay? And Baphomet, another charge in the accusation of the Templars, seems to be in a great degree proved by the depositions of the witnesses, right? Some of the knights added another circumstance in the confession: adore this head, this is the head, your God and your Muhammad. And Baphomet, he adds that he worshipped it by kissing its feet and exclaiming Allah. There's typos in the book. You can go to other passages, they have Allah, so that's just a mistake. Allah, okay, which he describes as a word of the Saracens, which we know to be the Muslims, right?
Yeah.
And the Templars had secretly embased Mohammedanism. Baphomet is evidently a corruption of Muhammad, and von Hammer gave a Greek derivation of the word and assumed it as proof that Gnosticism was the secret doctrine of the temple. Now, again, there's a link here between Gnosticism and Islam. There's every reason to believe that there was some foundation for the charges of heresy, okay? And it followed the doctrines and rites of the Gnostic Ophites of Islam. Baphomet namely being a corruption of Muhammad, okay? And there's a rejection of Christianity in favor of religion based on Gnostic dualism, being Islam. So they're linking Gnosticism and Islam here within this, these scholars are. And again, the worthiness of the Saracen nations, among them Templars had many friends, and the Templars introduced into their rites practices which savored of Gnosticism or Mohammedanism. Again, they are saying that Gnosticism and Mohammedanism are the same thing. In this text. Okay, I'll leave this here now. I will do one more thing, if I may. I'll be very quick about this then, since we are here. I'm going to go up here. Now, this is the most famous, most popular, most common of the Sharia law manuals in the world today. It's not the most complete, but it's certainly, this is the one manual which has a little bit of everything, and it directs you to other manuals, okay? This one's the most commonly available manual in the world. It's the most authorized, the most popular, right? Let's look up Gnos, okay? Just, you see Gnosis, there are 18 references, Gnostic 5, Gnostics, 3, and Gnostics with apostrophe 1. So I'm just going to look this up. Let's look at the Islamic scholars, and this is the most authorized because this conforms with Sunni Islam. It is authorized by Al-Azhar University. What few people realize is that Al-Azhar not only has schools dedicated to the 4 schools of jurisprudence, but also all 7 of the major schools of Sufism. And the current head of Al-Azhar is a Sufi. The previous head was a Sufi, just so you know. And they speak here of the spiritual stations of annihilation in Gnostic vision, right? Which the major scholars go through in the Latifa and the Haqaiq. They speak here of initiates must not stop at the first traces of gnosis and think that they're awesome. And they say here that others, the fools that came before them, the people who, you know, the ignorant people prior to the Muslims, okay, claimed to have achieved gnosis and contemplative knowledge of the divine. They claimed to have reached nearness to Allah. The previous Gnostics, they just made false claims. But we, the Muslims, we have attained to the gnosis. And they speak of the Gnostics, the states that the Gnostic goes through. That's the Muslim scholar. This is in reference to Muslim scholars. And they say that the Gnostic's spiritual will, exalted above all else, must carry him beyond into these pre-rational and post-rational states. He must leave the rational mind behind. And he has reached the level of those to whom the unseen is disclosed and who have Gnostic insight. See, this is religious worship in Islam. This is because the Sharia is just following the law, whereas the Haqiqah is following the religion, the religious aspects. They slip through the door of gnosis. They go through the 99 veils and they pierce into the throne room of Allah. Okay? And they say here that to properly perform Islam, you have to be immersed in the sea of Gnostic inspiration until you behold Allah the Most High. Right? Let's continue. Right? The Sufi Gnostic, the Gnostic. Certain things can only be comprehended through the gnosis, the grove of the Gnostics, and proper appreciation, for the perfection of faith, you must know Gnosticism. You must be a Gnostic. This is also part of the perfection of the faith in Islam. Gnosis, gnosis, gnosis. It just goes on like this. Gnosis, 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 gnosis.
So this,
and I can go on.
Yeah, it's pretty evident that they are upfront about the fact that it is a Gnostic.
I can show bunches of sources that say the same thing. Yeah. They don't hide it. Go to YouTube. They do not hide it. They are Gnostics.
Yeah. It seems to me that the Gnosticism provides them a Trojan horse in terms of inserting themselves into other cultures. If taking everything that you spoke about, the ability and willingness to deceive, and you spoke about at least Sufis claim that they were the founders of Freemasonry, that they brought it to England. Now I don't know at this stage whether I believe it or not. The only thing I would say is that, at least in the way Freemasonry presents itself as being religiously indifferent, it seems hard to believe that Sufis would have. I
can show you plenty of evidence to show you that when you look into the Freemasons, I can show you Islamic connections to Freemasonry very easily, and also above the Freemasons lies another level of Freemason called the Shriner. Now, the Freemasons do claim to be ideologically neutral or religiously neutral. They're non-denominational. However, I can very easily show you explicitly Islamic connections. And above the Freemasons, once you become a Freemason, an advanced Freemason, you can enter into a higher level of Mason called the Shriner. The Shriners are explicitly Islamic. Explicitly, I'm talking about their whole oaths and their dress, their all of their discussion. The word, it's Islamic. It's through and through Islamic. It's unmistakably Islamic. I can show that as well.
Yeah, that would be something worth looking at another time if you fancy coming back doing that. Yeah, in terms of St. Paul now, obviously we could be following this up with another episode. Is that right? Or
no, I finished St. Paul. So I finished St. Paul. I'm working now on the Injil. But that's the St. Paul episode. We've managed to finish
so that's St. Paul. Oh, that's okay. Fantastic. Well, listen, Lloyd, it's been fantastic. You've got a wealth of knowledge, and it's great to get it out there so people can learn all of these things. I've learned a load, and I'm sure probably will watch this a couple of times more because it's obviously a lot to take in. I've noticed in the comments that quite a few people say, I'm going to have to watch this 2 or 3 times. That's always a very good sign, so you've brought a lot of knowledge to us all. Just acknowledge everyone in the comments there. I'm sorry I haven't had an opportunity really to refer to individual comments because it's important to stay focused on what we're doing. But thank you so much, Lloyd.
Welcome.
There's
Thank you.
There's a lot of interesting areas that you're researching at the moment. I think there'd be the one that I'm probably most interested in going into the future is the fact that there are loads of different seerahs.
Yeah.
And you found evidence that they basically updated the narrative through time, essentially. And I think that's going to be huge because essentially there is no standard Islamic narrative. That's the next level. We've been talking about the standard Islamic narrative, but maybe there is no standard because it keeps changing. It should be standard Islamic narratives, and
there's only presenting evidence to win, to convince.
Yeah. So it's what's the word for that? It's a fake exterior.
Sophistry. It's a facade.
It's a facade, essentially. Yeah, there is no narrative. Ultimately, it's whatever is needed to win the argument. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity. I hope it's been educational to everyone. And Yeah, I have more on my channel if you'd like to look there, have a look there. I've discussed all of these topics, and this research is still evolving. There's room for you guys to grab this, go run, have a look for yourselves. I can only cover so many bases myself.
Yeah, and there's plenty of references in the comment section, in the description, sorry, below this video. So if you want to have a look there, if you want to follow up the research, please feel free. Lloyd, thank you so much. See you again very soon. Cheers.
Good night, everyone. God bless. Well.